In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen walked into the European Commission presidency with the most ambitious environmental agenda in European history. She called it the European Green Deal. She said it would make Europe the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050. She built her entire legacy around it. She pushed it through the European Parliament. She defended it against every attack. For 5 years, she protected it like it was her own child. Then, Giorgia Meloni walked in. And in the space of 6 weeks, without firing a single legal challenge, without going to court, without leaving the European Union, Meloni did what nobody thought was possible. She forced von der Leyen to gut her own plan. 210 billion euros worth of corporate sustainability obligations. Gone. Weakened beyond recognition. And Brussels is still trying to figure out what just happened. This is not a story about climate policy. This is a story about power. About who actually controls Europe. About how one woman from Rome rewrote the rules of the game that Brussels thought it owned forever. To understand what Meloni destroyed, you have to understand what von der Leyen built. The European Green Deal was not just a collection of climate targets. It was an architecture, a system. And at the center of that system were 2 laws that von der Leyen considered her most important legacy. The first was the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. Under CSRD, approximately 50,000 companies operating in Europe were required to publish detailed annual reports on their environmental impact, their social practices, their governance structures. Every gram of carbon, every supplier relationship, every workplace condition. All of it. Public, verified, legally binding. The second law was the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD. This one went even further. It made large companies legally responsible not just for their own operations, but for their entire supply chain. If a supplier in another country used forced labor, the European parent company could be held liable. If a contractor caused environmental damage, the company at the top of the chain faced lawsuits. Von der Leyen said these 2 laws would make European business the most responsible and transparent in the world. Critics said they would crush European competitiveness. For years, von der Leyen won that argument. And then, the political ground shifted under her feet.
The first signal came from Germany. Friedrich Merz became Chancellor in early 2026, facing an economy that had been in recession for 2 consecutive years. Germany's industrial base, the engine of European prosperity, was bleeding. Companies were relocating production outside Europe to escape regulatory costs. Merz ran on a platform of deregulation and economic recovery. He did not hide what he thought about von der Leyen's sustainability agenda. He called it a burden. He called it a competitive disadvantage. He said Europe was strangling its own businesses with paperwork, while China and the United States were not. And then he flew to Rome. On January 23, 2026, Merz and Meloni signed the Italo-German Protocol at Villa Doria Pamphili in Rome. This was not a routine bilateral meeting. This was a declaration. For decades, European politics had been driven by the Franco-German axis. France and Germany setting the direction, everyone else following. Merz chose Rome over Paris. He chose Meloni over Macron. The document they signed together called for sweeping deregulation across the European Union. It named CSRD and CSDDD explicitly. It said these directives needed to be fundamentally revised. And it made clear that Germany and Italy, 2 of the 3 largest economies in the European Union, were aligned in demanding change. Combined, Germany and Italy represent roughly 45% of EU GDP. When they speak together, Brussels cannot simply look away. 3 weeks later, on February 12th, EU leaders gathered for an informal summit in Belgium. Merz and Meloni arrived with a non-paper, a policy document laying out their shared vision for EU deregulation. The paper did not just target CSRD and CSDDD. It called for a fundamental rethinking of EU regulatory philosophy. It argued that Europe had buried itself under compliance costs, while its competitors moved faster and cheaper. It argued that the Green Deal's sustainability architecture was designed for a world that no longer existed, a world where European companies were not yet fighting for survival against American tech giants and Chinese industrial subsidies. The paper was received in Brussels with what one EU official privately described as controlled panic. Because Merz and Meloni were not asking for a debate. They were presenting a fait accompli. They had the numbers, they had the votes, and everyone in that room knew it.
This is where the story gets to its most important moment. Von der Leyen had a choice. She could fight, she could defend her legacy, she could say that CSRD and CSDDD were non-negotiable and dare the Merz-Meloni coalition to bring down her commission. But she did not do that, because she understood something that her critics did not give her credit for. If she fought and lost, and she would have lost, the outcome would have been even worse. The entire Green Deal would have been dismantled piece by piece in the most visible and humiliating way possible. So instead, she did something that looked like pragmatism, but was actually a retreat. She announced the Omnibus Package herself. The Omnibus Package was presented publicly as a simplification. Von der Leyen said she was making the sustainability rules more practical, more workable, more proportionate. What she was actually doing was gutting them. Under the revised CSRD, the threshold for compliance shifted dramatically. The original directive covered companies with more than 250 employees. The revised version covers only companies with more than 1,000 employees and more than 450 million euros in annual turnover. In a single decision, approximately 80% of the companies originally covered by CSRD were removed from its scope entirely. The CSDDD was cut even more severely. The threshold moved to companies with more than 5,000 employees and more than 1.5 billion euros in revenue. The legal liability provisions, the core enforcement mechanism that gave the law its teeth, were dramatically weakened. On February 24, 2026, the EU Council gave the Omnibus Package its final approval. The rebellion had succeeded.
Now here is the question that everyone in Brussels is asking quietly, but nobody wants to answer publicly. Did Meloni win because she was right about the policy? Or did she win because she was smarter about the politics? The answer is both. And understanding why requires looking at something most coverage of this story has missed entirely: the 194 billion euro calculation. Italy is the single largest beneficiary of the EU's Next Generation EU Recovery Fund in absolute terms. Italy is due to receive 194.4 billion euros in grants and loans from the fund by 2026. Italy's public debt stands at 147% of GDP, the highest in the Eurozone. Italy's economy cannot function without that money flowing in. Every analyst who covered Meloni's rise assumed this financial dependency would constrain her permanently. They assumed she would always blink first because she needed Brussels more than Brussels needed her. They were wrong. And they were wrong because they misunderstood the difference between needing EU money and needing EU regulations. The next generation EU disbursements run on a separate track. They are tied to reform milestones, not to corporate sustainability reporting requirements. Meloni understood this distinction precisely. She attacked the Green Deal regulations while protecting Italy's access to recovery funds. She chose her battlefield carefully. She did not fight where she was weak. She fought where she was strong. And she chose her allies even more carefully. Merz was not simply a convenient partner. He was a force multiplier. In the European Parliament, Meloni's party belongs to the European Conservatives and Reformists group, the ECR. After the 2024 European Parliament elections, the ECR and the broader right had grown significantly stronger. But Meloni knew that the ECR alone could not block von der Leyen's agenda. The EPP, von der Leyen's own center-right group, was the largest bloc. As long as the EPP stayed loyal to von der Leyen, she had a working majority. What Meloni needed was to split the EPP, and Merz gave her exactly that. When the German Chancellor, an EPP member, aligned himself publicly with Meloni's deregulation agenda, it sent a message to every conservative MEP in Brussels. The wind was changing. The majority von der Leyen had relied on was no longer guaranteed. Center-right politicians who had privately agreed with Meloni's economic arguments but publicly supported the Green Deal for political safety suddenly found it safer to move. That shift did not happen in one dramatic vote. It happened gradually, in committee rooms, in private conversations, as the political arithmetic changed week by week. There is one more dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. Trump. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, Meloni had a direct line to the most powerful political figure in the Western world, something no other European leader could claim with the same credibility. Trump publicly praised Meloni multiple times. He called her great. He said Italy under Meloni was becoming America's closest European ally. He also made no secret of his contempt for the European Green Deal and for EU regulations generally. His administration described EU sustainability directives as barriers to trade, as disguised protectionism, as bureaucratic overreach. When the American president was saying exactly what Meloni was saying, and when Merz was saying it too, von der Leyen's position was not just politically weakened inside Europe, it was geopolitically isolated. The EU's external credibility on climate leadership, already strained by America's withdrawal from Paris Agreement commitments, took another blow every time Washington and Rome spoke in the same voice. The people who lost most visibly in this fight were not von der Leyen. She managed her retreat in a way that preserved her formal position. The people who lost most visibly were the environmental organizations, the progressive MEPs, and the 210,000 Europeans who signed petitions demanding that CSRD and CSDDD be protected. They had spent years building the case for corporate accountability. They had won the argument in the previous parliament. And then the parliament changed. The politics changed. And the law changed with it. That is the part of this story that goes beyond Meloni and von der Leyen. Because what happened to those 210,000 people, and the laws they fought for, is what happens when the political center of gravity shifts faster than institutions can adapt. The Green Deal was not repealed. It was not declared invalid. It was simply made so narrow that it no longer functions as its architects intended. And that is a more durable victory for its opponents than any formal repeal would have been. Because it is much harder to rebuild a law that has been hollowed out than to restore a law that has been abolished. You cannot campaign against something that technically still exists. So where does Europe go from here? Von der Leyen will finish her second term defending whatever remains of the Green Deal framework. Merz will continue running Germany with an eye on economic recovery and defense spending rather than sustainability compliance. And Meloni will do what she has done since October 2022. Play her hand better than anyone expects. Hold her position longer than anyone thinks she can. And expand her influence, one calculated move at a time. The Italo-German axis she built with Merz has not dissolved. It has become the new center of gravity for EU economic policy. The Franco-German power couple that ran European politics for 2 decades is not coming back. Macron is domestically weakened. Scholz is gone. The architecture of European power has been reorganized, quietly, while everyone was watching the headlines about Trump and Ukraine. Meloni reorganized it. And she did it from inside the system, using the system's own tools, while collecting 194 billion euros in EU recovery funds. That is not a rebellion against Europe. That is something more sophisticated, more consequential. That is a takeover. The 210 billion euros was not just a number on a balance sheet. It was the price of von der Leyen's legacy. And Meloni made her pay it.